This is Dr. Annette Feravich with HealthyMindBodySpirit.net, and this is episode number 5 in my series on love and sex in the 21st century. So, thank you for joining me, and episode number 5, this episode is answering the question, are we supposed to love ourselves first? Okay, so today's episode is a takeoff from questions that I've had on my today's question. Today's questions are taken from emails that are sent to me, and you can send your questions to Dr. Feravich, F as in Frank, ERA, V as in Victor, ICH, Dr. Feravich at HealthyMindBodySpirit.net. So today's episode number 5, do we need to love ourselves before we can love others, is taken from a question that I got from today's question from an individual. And so what I decided to do was to make my entire episode around this question. Are we supposed to love ourselves before we can love other people? So I apologize for actually not having all the technology set up, but that's because I'm here in Dallas, Texas, and I wanted to make sure that I got online with you live in order to present this important topic. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit of our PowerPoint that I put together and talk about what we're going to talk about in today's agenda. All right, so first of all, don't forget that you can get your personal questions answered if you email me at Dr. Feravich at HealthyMindBodySpirit.net. So that's the first thing. Secondly, what I wanted to remind you of is that I have put a survey out there, if you remember. And that survey you can find on the internet, and here's a copy of it. It is a survey by Dr. Buss, David Buss, and this survey just asks for asks you some questions on mate preferences, and so you can find those questions and questionnaire there. So look for the mate preferences questionnaire and fill that out. Coming up in our next episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to give you some time to be able to take a look at that survey. I also have a copy of that survey in our PowerPoint here. And so if you want to, you can kind of capture this, do a screen capture, and that's the questions that I would like you to answer when we look at mate preferences. But right now, what I really want to do, remember, what we've been saying is that when we want to look at love, we want to look at love from this idea of a pyramid. Remember, we said that having an organization to pretty much anything that we do, if I have an organization for my goal, if I have an organization where I work, I have an organization in my home, I have an organization for the way that I packed for this Dallas trip, right? I have an organization for the way that I'm getting online. And there are priorities when I'm getting online for these conversations, right? So I need to make sure that I know what I want to talk about. That's a priority. Also, all of this equipment is a priority. I spent a lot of time today trying to make sure that I can get online and didn't have any glitches here in the hotel. But we always decide that there is a certain priority in what we do, and those priorities create a hierarchy. So I've had some people comment that they don't really care for the idea of starting this lecture or this series with this hierarchy, and that therefore some people feel like when we promote a hierarchy, that therefore it promotes positions that are lower in the hierarchy, and some people don't like that idea. They're uncomfortable with that idea. It creates what we're going to talk about today, cognitive dissonance. They don't like the idea that they might be on a lower rung in the hierarchy. It creates cognitive dissonance. What is cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling that we get when our attitudes don't match our behaviors. We're going to talk more about that today, but if you want to find out more about cognitive dissonance, I do have a short video on it in my series on self-esteem. So make sure that you look at my website, go to my website for that series on self-esteem, and look up cognitive dissonance. I'll give you a little bit more background today on it, but that's a real short video that will give you some information on it. So again, uncomfortable feelings that we have when our attitudes don't match our behaviors. And so sometimes people have uncomfortable attitudes or feel a discomfort when they see that we are suggesting that there's a hierarchy, which oftentimes can make people uncomfortable about power positions, right? Okay, but the importance in our hierarchy today is we see that positions in the hierarchy that produce a base or a foundation, they can help give strength to the power that is up on top. All right. Now, that doesn't necessarily make you feel better if you feel like the weight of the world is on top of you when you are at the bottom of this rung. Nevertheless, what that says is that there has to be kind of a willingness for us to participate in our position in this hierarchy. Now, we want to answer the question, do we need to love ourselves before we can love others? All right, let's take a look at this pyramid again and see where the need is to love ourselves. All right? This is what gives us flourishing, loving relationships, is what we said. We need to have infant attachment, which leads to adult attachment, which leads to love on this chart, but what we said is mature love. And what that leads to then are these flourishing relationships, right? What they require is purposeful behaviors. So depending on our relationship here, we can have an infant caregiver relationship. We can have an adult loving relationship. We can have mature love. So we can end up building on these two different types of attachment for real mature love. And then this gives us, like I said, flourishing relationships. Those are our relationships, and at each stage there are purposeful behaviors. When we engage in purposeful behaviors, what that is suggesting is that we need to consider somebody else. So again, we're looking at, do we need to love ourselves before we can love another person? Now, on that chart, taking a look at that chart, where is the need for love for ourselves? In mature love, we have to be willing to then give our love to another person. Every one of those pieces of that pyramid is not about loving ourselves, is it? It's about loving another person. And so, where does loving ourselves actually come in? Let's think about that. Where does loving ourselves actually come in? Well, if we take a look at that infant attachment, this is where, as I've said, we have the greatest need for our love. So we need love in order to formulate this trusting relationship, not only with our caregivers, but in order to form a trusting relationship with adults as well, right? We need that love, but is that love really promoting a selfish love? Do we need to love ourselves? Okay. When we talk about that, when we suggest that we have a need to love ourselves, that really is a self-motivated love, right? Okay. One of the things that we know is we know that our self-esteem, feelings of self-esteem, so feelings of love, is built on our knowledge, the knowledge that we have that about ourselves. So if we want to feel real love for ourselves, what we need to do then is promote an understanding of ourselves. What we end up doing is, very often is, we end up as we saw in Erickson's psychosocial stages, comparing ourselves to other people, like we do in social media, right? Like we do in the classroom, like we do when we are at conferences, like I'm at a conference. What do? We compare ourselves with other people. Are my comments as smart as somebody else's comments, right? Do I show affection in my loving relationships like other people do? Do I have real talents in the classroom that so that so I understand math, and so I'm a great reader? These are the things that promote loving ourselves. When we don't have the experiences that we need to love ourselves, that's when we experience what I said was called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. Again, this is an uncomfortable feeling that we have when our attitudes don't match our behaviors. All right. So, our attitude is that we should love ourselves. And yet, what we end up doing is sometimes, not always, but what we end up doing is maybe choosing partners who aren't good for us. Maybe getting into a career because it pays good money as opposed to finding something that we love, where we end up working so hard that we become addicted to our jobs and to the money and to the lifestyle, or even to just simply the same behaviors. Once we get into this routine where we are working from, 6:30 in the morning until 8 p.m. at nighttime, we get in that routine, we feel dissonance if we are not in that routine. So what we end up doing then is creating these lives that we think are supposed to be fulfilling as we sort of traverse down our paths. And every once in a while, we come across an uncomfortable feeling that says, I'm not so happy. This life isn't really going where I want it to go. And so, what is our first natural tendency? Our first natural tendency is to protect, make ourselves feel better, right? To become defensive. And if we feel that in some way who we are, our self-esteem is being attacked. This can be attacked in many ways, right? Our self-esteem can be attacked by somebody verbally attacking us, disparaging us, putting us down. But our self-esteem can actually be affected simply by being in a classroom with individuals who are smarter than I am. That can make me feel defensive. And what ends up happening then is what rises to the top of my thinking are all my inadequacies. Again, I want you to know how this happens. It happens through a natural process called cognitive dissonance. I'm in a classroom with people who are smarter than me, and I know I'm smart. I know I'm smart. I know if they got to know me that they would see how smart I am. Or if they talk to me about this subject and not that subject, they would see that really I'm a very smart person. So there's our defensiveness right that there naturally rises up when we feel cognitive dissonance. Now we have some choices then about what we do when we feel this dissonance. We can change our attitudes, because we can change our cognitive dissonance, for example, by saying, well, we are really smart. We are really smart. When we're in a classroom where we feel like we're not so smart, we can change our cognitive dissonance by telling ourselves that we are really smart. But the problem with that is this: cognitive dissonance is an attitude. So we can change our cognitions about it, but sometimes that doesn't change our heart beliefs. And somewhere deep down inside, we may still fear that we're smart in this area, but I better not open up my mouth at this conference because I'm not so smart in that area, right? Okay, so again, we are motivated to change this dissonance. How do we change the dissonance? Do we change it by changing our thoughts about ourselves, which sometimes is good, but not long lasting. If we continue to ruminate about the evidence that we are not that person we claim to be, then it's going to be difficult to convince our minds that we actually are. So right now what we've said is we can change our thinking, which we can convince ourselves, but sometimes doesn't really change our attitudes. We call that public and private beliefs, that we have public and private beliefs. Sometimes I'm willing to say at a conference all the things I really actually believe in. But other times there are things that I won't say right out loud to the public. Those are my private beliefs. Okay, so sometimes I can change sort of my public beliefs in my mind, but it doesn't necessarily change my private beliefs in my heart when I feel cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling. And you know, as psychologists, we call that cognitive dissonance, and very often we give some really great names to some of this psychological phenomenon. But actually what we're talking about in lay terms, we're talking about hypocrisy. We're being hypocritical to who we feel that we truly are. So I can give this public persona, but I'm not being true to myself. And in layman's terms, we call that a hypocrite. I'm being a hypocrite. Now you can see when I use those terms why it might leave me feeling uncomfortable when my attitudes don't match my behaviors. I'm behaving like a hypocrite. Right. So what I said was that I can change my attitudes. I can change my thoughts. Thoughts are harder because there's private feelings. And I can change my attitudes about this. Okay. So here inside. And finally, what I can also do is I can change my behaviors. So let's use a classic example of smoking. All right. I know smoking is bad for me. I know cognitively it is bad for me, but it's difficult to change my behaviors. Right. So what do? What I do is I add consonant thoughts to my schemas, my thoughts that I have on, for example, smoking. All right. So how do I relieve this dissonance that I have? We get it all the time. We're speeding down the road and we start slipping. Dissonance. I shouldn't have been doing that. Another example that I have, giving to charity. We all know it's good to give to charity, yet we also know that only 25% of Americans give to charity. If you're a religious person, you're supposed to tithe. What do we do to change our attitudes about that? Because we don't change our behaviors. We don't go and tithe or give to charity. What we do is we change our attitudes and we say that, oh, they're always looking for money. Or if I give to that charity, they are wasteful. I wonder how much actually gets to the people. I'm not going to give to that homeless person because they're only going to be using it for alcohol. So those are all the reasons why I might not give to charity like I was brought up to do. All right, so we don't very often change our behaviors. Sometimes it's hard to change our thinking, but we can change our attitudes, which then lends itself to changing our thinking eventually if we add consonant ideas. What are consonant facts or ideas? Consonant ones are those facts or ideas or thoughts that agree with my behavior. So I have behavior and my attitude that disagree. I'm just going to add some more thoughts in my head that will make those two things agree, like smoking relaxes me, or that I would be eating too much if I didn't smoke. Okay, so we can think about this for all kinds of habits that are not good for us, right? So what do those bad habits do? Those bad habits create dissonance. So now what does this have to do with loving ourselves? When we feel this dissonance, when we feel unloved, is we are naturally inclined to give ourselves self-love. Isn't that good? Well, Let's take a look at a few other things to help us answer that question a little bit better. All right, I'm going to take a look at this slide which talks about flourishing relationships and how can we be more mindful of the people we love. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to the top of that pyramid, and we're going to see what flourishing relationships look like in order to answer the question, do I need to love myself before I love other individuals? All right, now what you see here on the left hand side, we have got behaviors that are adaptive behaviors. We consider these behaviors adaptive behaviors. And then on the right hand side, these are non-adaptive or maladaptive behaviors. And also in these behaviors, what we have is we have got a hierarchy of behaviors so that when we begin a flourishing, loving relationship, what we want to do is we want to start with the very first thing listed there on the adaptive side, and we don't want to do what's on the non-adaptive or maladaptive side, all right? And then we progressively, as we become more intimate, we are able to engage in these flourishing behaviors more readily because we have the foundation for those behaviors to begin with. So let's take a closer look at this. Number one, the very first adaptive behavior is how do we behave? What we do is we are adaptive, we are flourishing via an in-depth knowing process. Both partners are in step in seeking to know and be known by the other. One of the very first basic needs that we have is to know and to be known. When we fall in love with somebody, even from a distance, don't we often think, if only that person knew me? If that person really knew me, then I know that they would love me. If they knew that I was a great cook, if they knew that I was fluent in Spanish, if they knew that I had a PhD, if they knew that I was a great singer, if they ever saw me sing a song, if they ever heard me write a song, right, then they would love me. So our biggest need for love actually is to be known. But in order for us to be known, we have to be willing to know the other person. All right, so here we see very clearly that in order for us to get our fulfillment, the love that we need for ourselves, which is to be known, that what we have to do is we have to be willing to know. Again, 50% of people of marrying ages are married today. We have to, if we want to be known, we have to be willing to know. Let's take a look at that from a maladaptive relationship. One or both partners are out of step in seeking to know and be known by the other. Out of step. What does this mean then? What does this mean that we are out of step? Go back to our video where we talk about attachment styles, and in particular adult attachment styles. Maybe you have the attachment style, it leaves us feeling anxious in a relationship, and yet we don't want to avoid relationships. And these individuals are clingy individuals, right? So again, there's a misstep in knowing and being known. If I am anxious about relationships but run into them time and time again, so low avoidance on those relationships, then what am I going to be doing that's out of step? Well, likely I'm going to want to be known all the time. Right? I need you to know me. I need you to know me. I need you to treat me this way. I need you to talk to me this way. I need you to call me. I need you to text me, right? I need you. I need you. I need you. Okay? Other individuals are givers in relationships, so they are always wanting to know that partner so that they could always jumping through hoops then because I know you. That's out of step, right? Or how about individuals that you're with that don't care to know you at all? Don't care that you took a class. don't care that you have an interest in art, don't listen to you play music, right? So you have a partner who doesn't care about some of those really intimate things that are important to you. That's a maladaptive relationship. All right, so we're still answering the question. Do we need to love ourselves first? So if we are in step with knowing and being known, then what we end up doing is both partners use that knowledge gained in enhancing the relationship. Okay? And then maladaptive behaviors would be knowledge gained in the knowing process, right? Knowing and being known. The knowledge that is gained in that process is not used or not used well, that they may be used to hurt the other person. All right, so how might we then use our knowledge in positive ways? If I know that you wanted to go back to school to start a career, then what I would do is I could use that knowledge in positive ways to decide to help out with the kids or take on more chores at home or decide to how to help you study for your test, for example, right? So I can use this knowledge in order to benefit my partner. I can also use that knowledge in order to hurt my partner. So I know that you want to go to school, and instead what I do is I complain about dinner not being ready, right? Or I decide to criticize you for that, right? I criticize you. What do you think you're going to learn? What are you going to end up doing with that? All right. Okay. So those would be maladaptive behaviors. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Is in adaptive behaviors, both partners accept what they learn and respect the other for the person they learn about. As opposed to maladaptive behaviors, acceptance of what is learned is low, as is respect for the other person. So that would say that that person does not likely want to accept what you're doing. If that person is not accepting or respecting you, this is where they end up making disparaging remarks. Right? Let's say, for an example, I tell you about a time in my life where I got fired from a job. And I can tell you about how that hurt my feelings and about how that may have damaged some of my self-confidence and my self-esteem. As a partner who is my partner, a loving partner, they can use that information then to help make sure that they build me up in my next job, right? To help take a look at some of the things that I might be able to improve in a constructive way. Or did they use that information to then disparage me further? That's what we're talking about here when we're talking about maladaptive behaviors. We're talking about labeling individuals in negative, using negative traits that are stable and long-term. Those are maladaptive behaviors. And then remember also what we said is that then how are you accepting those things? Are you accepting of those things and saying that that's a partner that I love, and looking at those kinds of qualities in ways that you might be able to appreciate that person? Or are you more so looking at ways that you can use that information to damage the other person? The next one here that I want to discuss is that both partners are motivated to continue this process and do so indefinitely, such that synchrony and synergy of thought, feeling, and action emerge. Now, this is something that I feel is slightly transcendent. When you are capable of synergy and synchrony in your thought, feelings, and actions, what you are doing is not just transforming the individual, you are transforming yourself. This is something that is unique that we get to build ourselves up, to edify ourselves from another person that simply self-love cannot promote. Think about that. I cannot love myself from another person's perspective. And what do you suppose that does for me when I see not that I love myself, but that another person is capable of loving me? Do we need to love ourselves first? What does that do for me when I see that another person is capable of loving me for me? And is that different than what it does for me when I simply love myself first? Let's move on to the maladaptive behaviors then. So we said for adaptive behaviors, both partners are motivated to continue this process and do so indefinitely such that synchrony and synergy of thought, feeling, and action emerge, as opposed to one or both partners are not motivated to engage in the overall minding process or do so sporadically. Little synchrony and synergy emerge. And so there are times where we have partners who are willing to, at times, or at least know that they should support us, right? That they should say supportive things and that they should try and do things that will help you get your goals. We know that we're supposed to do that, but there are times where individuals don't do that. What ends up happening is they do promote their partner, but they're not consistent with it. When we have that real loving feeling for our partners, we demonstrate that in our attitudes and our behaviors consistently. And this then is how our partners are edified by our love. We talked about the fact that this is difficult for partners to do. It's difficult for partners to do. Why? Because we are consistently disappointed with the other person, right? We are human beings. I disappointed my husband disappointed me. It's one of the reasons why at the top of the pyramid, that God is love. And maybe think about what that means to us. Because when we don't, what we end up doing is living a life of dependence on events and people that simply are not made to come through for us. So those are some of the things I want you to think about as we're talking about all of this, okay? The last behavior, adaptive behavior that lends itself to flourishing relationships. The last one, both partners in time develop a sense of being special and appreciated in the relationship. All right, so when we engage in these positive behaviors over time, we begin to feel special. As opposed to one or both partners fail to develop a sense of being special and appreciated in the relationship. What we end up gaining then is this feeling that we are special in the eyes of our partner. Now, this is the question I want to pose to you. Do you think that you could gain that feeling by simply loving yourself, by figuring out ways to love yourself? Do you think that the feeling would be equal to the feeling that we get about ourselves when someone else chooses to love us? Just hold that thought. Just hold that thought for a minute. Do we get the same feelings when we love ourselves and do things for ourselves as we get when another person chooses to love us? Remember when I was talking before about Erich Fromm's quote about how we think love is easy because we fall in love so easy, but actually love is difficult. And love is difficult because what we realize that we have to do to have real love is not necessarily love ourselves more. What we need to do is we need to love others more. This is the golden rule, that we are supposed to love others as we love ourselves. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you, right? So it's interesting that we do need to love ourselves to get closer to the answer to this question. But how we love ourselves appears to be through loving others. And when others then, in return, love us. What I want to tell you now is I want to show you some of the differences then that we see in the benefits of loving others and differences in loving ourselves. Okay, so there are, from Aristotle introduced two terms that are related to happiness. One term is hedonic happiness, and the other term is eudaimonic happiness. So let's take a look at those two different types of happiness. When we talked in last week's episode, we were talking about why were we focusing on happiness as opposed to focusing on love. And the reason that we focused on happiness was because, first of all, more data, but that's not the only reason. This is where a lot of data exists so we can see differences. But the idea is that we need to know that we are satisfied, right? So happiness studies talk about actually satisfaction, and love doesn't mean anything if we're not satisfied with the person that we're loving, right? Marriages don't mean anything if we're not satisfied in our marriages. And if you recall, we talked about some of those patterns for satisfaction with marriage, the patterns that we have for passion, and the patterns that change over time for intimacy, right? If you remember, passion decreased over our marriages or over our long-term relationships. However, intimacy increased. And this intimacy is related to greater satisfaction than passion is. So that's the reason why we look at satisfaction. Now what we're looking at is we're looking at what really satisfies us. What are the ingredients to true, real satisfaction? What researchers looked at was differences between hedonic pleasures and eudaimonic pleasures, and Aristotle helped us define these. So when we're talking about hedonic pleasures, we're talking about pleasures of the senses. Now, very often when we say that we need to love ourselves more, what we often are doing is feeding pleasures of our senses. What do? We decide to what? Curl up underneath a warm blanket and watch a good movie and eat popcorn or sweets or sugar, right? We're doing something for ourselves, and it gives us a hedonic pleasure of our senses. Okay, we even do this when we decide to, for example, eat, right? That's a pleasure of our senses. So if we decide to solve our problems by eating, or if we decide to solve our problems by drinking or going to the bar and picking somebody up, or starting a short-term relationship, right? A physical relationship with somebody that doesn't have any emotional ties. All of those behaviors are strategies that feed our hedonic pleasures. Now, we want to understand this clearly because we want to understand what is really going to be fulfilling for us, right? What is really truly satisfying us. So when we look at hedonic pleasures, they are subjective. That hedonic pleasures are based on our own opinions or our feelings. I can't tell you that it's going to make you feel better to eat broccoli when you know that it's going to make you feel better to eat ice cream. All right? So our fulfillment of these hedonic pleasures are being filled through subjective means. What I believe will make me feel better. And what is eudaimonic happiness? Eudaimonic happiness, EU means good. And demonic is spirit. So when we see that prefix EU, that means good spirit. Now, initially, when we were talking about authentic happiness, we said that we needed 3 things for authentic happiness. The 3 things included pleasure of the senses. We also needed to be engaged in life. We need to be doing things. One of the reasons why people got so depressed because of the pandemic is because they were no longer engaged in the things that were important, that really lifted their spirits, that gave them eudaimonic happiness, right? So what gives us authentic happiness? We do need pleasure of the senses. We want to right now, we want to discern between these two because we're going to talk about the outcomes of these two, all right? But that doesn't mean that we don't need pleasures of the senses in order to be happy. We absolutely do. Number 2, we need engagement. That's also called the good life. So we need the pleasant life. We need the good life. And number 3 is we need the purposeful life. We need meaning, purpose and meaning. And that's what Aristotle described as eudaimonic happiness. Our eudaimonic happiness is based on fulfilling basic psychological needs. So what are those? And there are 3 basic psychological needs. What are those 3 basic psychological needs? We've talked about these in the past before, and it's important for us to make sure that we remember what these needs are, because they're critical. They're critical psychological needs. As we journey through our lives, we are trying to unconsciously fulfill these 3 basic psychological needs. So what are they? The 3 needs are autonomy. I need to be independent, but also responsible for my choices. I need to be able to make free choices independent of somebody else, but that also means that I take the responsibility for those choices as well. So that is number 1 basic psychological need. Number 2 basic psychological need is competence. I need to feel like I am contributing something to society. This is engagement. If I am engaged in whatever it is, my job, downhill skiing, my children, writing stories, whatever it is, if I am engaged in what I'm doing, it builds my confidence in who I am. Psychological needs, 3 basic psychological needs. Number 1, autonomy. Number 2, competence. Number 3, interrelatedness. It's our 3rd basic psychological need. Inter, meaning between others. I need a relationship with others. So here again, we sort of see an exclusion of having to love ourselves first. This episode that I'm talking about, when I'm talking about loving ourselves first, it'd be nice if I could give you like a just straight up answer, yes or no. What I want you to do is I want you to critically think about what that means. Do we need to love ourselves? Of course we need to love ourselves. What we need to do is we need to prioritize. How important is it? Is that the number 1 need? What we are seeing is that loving yourself is actually a process. It's a process of knowing who I am, building up those skills, and then developing them in ways that other people can love me for them, right? So that's what we're talking about. Is there a yes or no? Do we have to love ourselves before we can love other people? We have to love ourselves before we can love other people. That may be a different question, right? That may have a different answer. Okay. So those 3 psychological needs, autonomy, competence, and interrelatedness, are fulfilled through eudaimonic happiness. Why? Because in eudaimonic happiness, we are looking for and gearing ourselves more towards meaning and purpose than we are gearing ourselves towards what are my needs, hedonic pleasures. All right, let's look at what else we want to say about this. All right, when we are talking about hedonic happiness, we are defining it according to Aristotle, which is being true to yourself. That is another way that Aristotle would define eudaimonic happiness. Now, this is really important because here's where we begin to see where we may need to love ourselves. Loving ourselves means that we are true to ourselves. But being true to ourselves may not necessarily mean that what we're doing is fulfilling then hedonic pleasures. Is that the definition of being true to ourselves? We see that according to Aristotle, that's not what that means. What love really is meaning and purpose. Being true to ourselves is meaning and purpose. So, being true to ourselves does not mean we are fulfilling hedonic needs. Being true to ourselves means that we are seeking authentic purpose and meaning in our lives. Okay. And then the last one there is that it says it's objective. Where we said Hedonic happiness is subjective and it's based on opinion. Hedonic happiness is objective. We can look at and measure whether or not you are on your path towards meaning and purpose. That's what we're saying. Now, I want to talk about then what are the outcomes that we've seen scientifically relative to these different types of happiness. Well, what we've seen, and again, this is empirical evidence, is that individuals who focus on hedonic happiness actually do not handle stress and actually have more negative health outcomes. Those individuals who focus on eudaimonic happiness end up having greater health and longevity. So when we're taking a look at real outcomes of whether or not we should love ourselves, what we're finding is that when we strive for those basic needs, autonomy, competence, and interrelatedness, we have to do so outside of ourselves in order to find our true self. And when we find our true self, that's when we see greater mental and physical health outcomes. You want to know why we are experiencing these great levels of depression and anxiety? Because we keep thinking that we need to love ourselves, and when we feel that we don't love ourselves because we're feeling anxious or depressed, so what we end up doing instead of going outside of ourselves is we turn inward and we begin to please ourselves, which fulfills our hedonic pleasures. It does not fulfill our long-term needs for meaning and purpose in our lives. And as we can see, what ends up happening is there's a great return from out here that doesn't come from in here, because what we did out here did come from in here. So how do we get meaning and purpose? By going outside of ourselves. What is returned? What is returned is something that fulfills ourselves, right? So, do you love yourself enough to go outside of yourself for others? Can you put aside your depression and anxiety to go outside yourself for others? Because that's when you get the feedback that you need in order to figure out, are these loving relationships that I'm in? Am I being true to myself? Am I being fulfilled with meaning and purpose in my life? We need to go outside of ourselves to get that return. And that answers the question. But I still have more to talk about. Hold on. All right. So now, if you recall, in our last episode, we talked about the hedonic treadmill. And the hedonic treadmill is where we end up seeing something that we want, buying something that we want, knowing that that something makes us happy. But then, if you recall, we adapt back to that happiness, right? And this can happen in loving relationships. We see our future intimate other. We want them. So we court them. That courting makes us happy. And then what happens? Once we get settled into a relationship, we adapt and we need other things to fulfill us, right? So what is it then that we can do to get off of that hedonic treadmill? And as you can see, once again, these things have a lot to do with not loving ourselves. We don't see things like crawl up in bed, watch a movie, and eat popcorn. That's what gets us out of off the hedonic treadmill. We don't see that. What we see is, number one, be kind and help. What that does is it returns feelings of gratitude. And when I feel gratitude, I don't so much have to fulfill my own needs. Number two, we have there, savor the moment. How do we savor the moment? One way that we savor the moment is, for example, by spending purposeful time thinking about a pleasurable event. So, one great way that we can actually stimulate our neurotransmitters, including serotonin and dopamine, would be to plan an event where I can savor a great time. So let me give you an example. As I said, I'm here in Dallas and I had a wonderful conference. So now, what can I do? So one of the things I'm doing is still enjoying my time in Dallas. It's one way that I'm extending those really good feelings that I have about Dallas, right? But if I decide to make a plan to talk about this with a friend or even talk about it on air with you, if I decide to do that, that's another way that I can relive my Dallas moments, right? Or it's another way that I can savor the moment. I might decide when I get back to take a bubble bath and just think about all the things because I learned so much at this conference. So taking the time to think about those things that I learned is another way that I can savor the moment. I might decide to do that by taking a bubble bath and thinking about all those things. Now look at how much I have pinned positive associations to my Dallas trip. I have extended those good positive feelings from my Dallas trip in order to get the benefits both neurologically and even cognitively and spiritually, that I get the benefits of my one single trip. So another way that you can savor moments is making sure that you take mental pictures. So looking at somebody's face, especially somebody you love, look at their face. And then when you're on a trip and you're away from them, you have that beautiful mental picture that you can call up in your mind. Another way might be, and this is what I'm actually hoping that my sons do, as I took pictures and collected pictures all the time that they were growing up. So I have giant bins with hundreds of pictures in them. A great way for them to savor their childhood would be to go through those pictures and go through all of the memorabilia that I collected for them over the years. And that would help them remember great points about their childhood. So some of the things that you want to think about is how long you are taking to savor the moment or even take pictures, right? Are you taking time to savor moments that are important to you? Also, the more complex that you store that memory with more associations, the more you are going to recall those good feelings when you're savoring the moment. We know that when individuals savor moments, that they reduce their levels of stress. They make greater social connections because we are savoring moments with other people. And what this does is, it says here I have balanced self-monitoring. Balanced self-monitoring. All of us monitor our own behaviors, but some of us are much more anxious about the way that we monitor our behaviors, and others of us monitor our behaviors in a more automatic and a comfortable way. And I feel that more of that self-consciousness as a teenager than I do when I'm a grown adult. Okay. When we say balanced self-monitoring, I'm not as concerned with my needs, and I can balance what is going on without having this extra sort of mirror on all of my behaviors. That's self-monitoring. So individuals who savor the moment take a lot of that self-conscious attention off of them, making them more balanced and more stable in their behaviors. In other words, they're less neurotic is what they are when they're able to balance and savor the moments. Okay, the next one that we have here is nourish important relationships. So when individuals want to get off of the hedonic treadmill, what do? They don't go inside of themselves and satisfy their own needs. They nourish other people's important relationships, again, so that we can get the return of that love, so that we're not getting it from an empty place ourselves, right? And manufacturing love for ourselves when we feel that we may not be worthy for others to love us. Okay, and then last one, of course, pursue meaningful goals in your life. Okay, now I want to talk about we have in this country growing disparities between the very rich and poor. And because we have these disparities, we are beginning to see inequalities up front and personal, right in front of our faces, right? So when we live in a neighborhood that's a poor neighborhood and we see people who have money and who have other choices, what that ends up doing then is making us very aware of the disparities between us and others. Another example of that is social media. We get on social media and what we see great disparities between what's going on as far as family events and what people are trying to do, or as far as what they're accomplishing in their life. And we see these great disparities. So when I see this disparity between me and other people on social media, what does that actually motivate you to do? It motivates me to do some things. What does it motivate you to do? Does it motivate you to engage with other people, build loving relationships? Does it motivate you to post something that's bigger and better on social media? Does that end up then getting you to behave in adaptive ways or maladaptive ways? And some of those maladaptive ways are dishonest. Sometimes we feed ourselves things that we want to hear when they simply aren't the truth. Why might we do that? We might do that because it's easier to get us where we want to be. But it only ends up fulfilling hedonic pleasures. So you really want to begin to understand the differences in happiness. So that why? So that we can get the return on love based on our investments. Are you investing in love? Okay, so again, we do these comparisons in social media. And what we end up doing is we end up then focusing on the disparities between us and others. Number 2 there, we say level of wealth is quickly habituated. And what this is, we end up escalating our expectations. So this is the hedonic treadmill. What we end up doing is becoming accustomed to our levels of happiness, our levels of wealth, and we begin to once again look at the disparities. The bottom line is we are no longer grateful for what we have. We feel relative deprivation. What is relative deprivation? I feel that I'm deprived relative to somebody else, relative to what I see. When individuals concentrated on what we call external strivings. And so what those are is trying to fulfill hedonic needs. So getting things, watching TV, eating sweets, sleeping all day, right? Those are external strivings. What we find is that those individuals have lower vitality. They have less self-actualization. If you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top of that was self-actualization. So these individuals are not, for example, finding meaning and purpose in their lives, and they also have more physical distress, which leads to health complications. For individuals who are looking for internal needs that are fulfilled, our psychological needs that are being fulfilled, that these individuals have higher mental and physical well-being. They are healthier and happier individuals. And then the last thing that I have there is what is the remedy for this kind of discontent that we feel, especially as it relates to relative deprivation, as it relates to social comparison, where I come out on the bottom. What's the remedy? The remedy is, the word is flow, but what we're saying is get engaged. What is the remedy for feeling these feelings of disparity, of feeling that I am unloved? The remedy is get engaged in life. That is where you get your returns. And we know that you get your returns in all of those areas that fulfill your psychological needs. So you will get returns on a sense of competence that you have in your skills and in yourself. That is self-love. You will get returns on feelings of freedom and autonomy, and that you can take on responsibility, that you can cope. That's what you end up getting when you engage in life, when you go outside of yourself. You also end up getting those new relationships where you can then experience other people liking and loving you for who you truly are. Now, I know that when I bombard you with a lot of these concepts, that it begins to get difficult for you to be able to weed through some of these concepts to be able to get a very clear idea of strategies that you need to use. So the bottom line here is I gave you some really good information and evidence for reasons why, yes, we do need to love ourselves, but that we don't do it by actively engaging in ourselves. That is the irony in all of this. All right, so let's take a look at some real strategies. So the very first thing that we want to do is spend money on experiences or life-satisfying events. And that also can include spending money on others as well. One engages us in life, the other one engages us in relationships. When we talk about experiences, they should be simple pleasures. More is not better. So what we want to do is invest in those things that are simple pleasures. We want to make sure that when we are using our money, that we are using our money to benefit others rather than ourselves. Make sure that you make wise comparisons so that when you're comparing yourself, you are not comparing yourself to individuals who have so much more than you. You want to try and make comparisons with other people who are like you. And those comparisons, you actually want those comparisons to be comparisons that are slightly above you, but not extremely above you. Okay, so our social comparisons that are slightly above us help motivate us to move along in a direction, right, without comparing ourselves to people who are way above us, where we begin to feel it's hopeless to be able to move along and do better. If I compare myself, as I've said before, to Michael Jordan, as a basketball player, I may decide to give up and never go into basketball. If I decide to compare myself instead to somebody who is on my team, or somebody who, if I'm an 8th grader, I compare myself to a 10th grader on the basketball team, or 11th grader, that gives me something to aspire to. So that's what we want to do. Keep a gratitude journal. One of the reasons why we believe that we don't measure up to other people is because we do not see the rewards in what we have. If we saw rewards in what we have, we may feel, for example, more loved than we actually feel. We may not have to seek out me time if I realize that I have friends to talk to, I have meals to eat, I have a home, a warm home and shelter, I have got nice clothes, or the fact that you can make ends meet, that you don't have to live beyond your means, that you have wonderful coping skills, that you have an education, that you read a wonderful book. All of these things demonstrate then that we are grateful for what we have. And being grateful changes our mindset for what we think we need. Okay? So keeping a gratitude journal is important as well, and can help move us into actually less depressive states and less anxiety because we have less need for having things we don't have. Okay, the next one, discover your flow. Discover your flow. So we talked about that, discovering what you're good at, discovering what you love to be engaged in, and then doing that. Have that be your fallback when you are bored and you don't know what to do. Develop your sense of flow in an area where you are talented. Finish what you start and experience it along the way. There is a common expression that we use in positive psychology, and this common expression that we use is being in the here and now. What you want to do in order to experience flow, in order to experience gratitude, in order to savor the moments, is you need to be in the here and now. You can't take a mental picture to savor later on if you are not available in the moment to take the mental picture. For us to have full appreciation, what we talk about, there's a saying that says, when you look at the past, it leads to depression. You look at the future, you lead to anxiety. You need to stay in the here and now to be able to generate just the right feelings you need to get through your journey and to help get through your day. So be in the here and now. Take notice of the beautiful sky. And when we do that, we don't then suffer from relative deprivation and social comparison in unhealthy ways. Okay, all right. And then the next one, find a hobby. What finding a hobby does is it helps us, of course, be in the here and now, and helps us develop flow. That helps us become more and more engaged in what we're doing in our lives. Cultivate ties. Cultivating ties helps us, once again, stay in the here and now, but it also helps us become consciously aware about whether or not we're extending ourselves in ways that we will get the rewards that we need. It is clear that we are not getting the internal rewards that we need by simply satisfying our selfish needs. We've been doing this for a long time. It's the reason why we see that statistic on marriage have reduced by 30%. Why is that? Because we keep thinking that the answers are in serving ourselves when the answer really is in serving others. The last one that we have there is practice spirituality. And practicing spirituality is important because of many things. First of all, we know that individuals who are spiritual actually live longer, healthier, happier lives. It contributes to their mental and physical health. But being spiritual also helps you not experience the great cognitive dissonance that we sometimes experience when we're not feeding ourselves and our own self-interest. That thought that keeps coming up, that I must feel bad because I don't have enough me time, because I'm not doing enough for myself, because I'm trying to do too much for other people. Many of those things can be true. What we're doing in these episodes and in these series is we are refining the complexity of our understanding for getting our most basic needs fulfilled. We need to refine the complexity of understanding how we get our needs fulfilled. It is very easy, doesn't take a whole lot of critical thought to say, I feel bad, make myself feel better. It takes much more critical thought to say, I feel bad, I have to extend myself to others in order to feel better. Do I need to love myself before I can love others? Yes, I do. But how I do that is by loving others. So, there you have it. Okay, this is Dr. Annette Feravich from Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit, and I hope that you are joining me here on Sundays at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Please remember to visit my website, www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. And in visiting that website, make sure that you check out any of the new specials that I have for nutrition. Also, remember to add your question if you want to today's question. You email me your questions at Dr. Feravich at healthymindbodyspirit.net. Join me next Sunday, July 25th, for my next episode. This episode now, we're going to be moving down the pyramid more. And so we are going to now move from our pinnacle of love and loving others and loving ourselves to now getting into dating relationships where we are beginning to embark on loving relationships, but we're not quite there yet. So join me for a philosophical look at love in our next episode in our series on love and sex in the 21st century.